So in 1988, when I entered analytic school, of course, a core component is being in one's own analysis. But the way they organized so it would be possible for working professionals, even UPS truck drivers, is that you'd have classes on Saturday, one in the morning from 9 to 12, and then another one from like 2 to 5. And my first class I had was on Karen Horney. And I remember reading Karen Horney's work, and just so much of these ideas seem similar to ideas in Buddhism, is that suffering is conditioned, it's not sinful, projection or mental afflictions are kind of rooted in kind of our development, our culture. It's not kind of a moral corruption in some way, that there is kind of an ongoing anxiety in living and being. And this doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. And also a really central focus on relationships, on interconnection between people and how that kind of develops into one's personality, one's defense pattern, one's coping skill. But something that I read early on that has stuck with me now for 40 years was Horner's ideas about how we might work with this basic anxiety. I think you could call this existential anxiety, maybe inevitable suffering, as Freud might postulate, was that there was kind of three basic stances. One was moving towards getting closer, potentially clinging, potentially wanting to control, perhaps wanting to become part of in some way, which seemed very similar to, although these are translated in different ways, what's known as the three poisons in Buddhism. And that would be the poison of passion. Then the second way of working with basic anxiety for Honai was moving against, having aggression, wanting to control, wanting to destroy, potentially annihilation, which can be translated in Buddhism as this kind of energy of aggression. And then the last one was the energy of moving away, ignoring, avoiding. And in Buddhist tradition, this would be seen as kind of ignorance, of not opening our eyes, of just kind of closing down into our cocoon in some way. Something else that struck me is some similarities here between so many analytic thinkers, and in Horney, basic anxiety is similar to the experience of being what Buddhists can sometimes call a dukkha, and that how we develop ideas about how to manage our lives is that one of the primary factors. So that was my morning class. And then in my afternoon class, I had, an overview of Freud, as you would have to have in your first semester of any psychoanalytic training institute. And again, I felt like, many, many kind of similarities, but also kind of many differences. We talked about the inevitable suffering and how we might deal with that. And I think it gets translated sometimes. I haven't read Mark Salm's new translation. My partner studies pretty intensively with Mark Salms, is like a leading figure in neuropsychoanalysis. But that in Civilization and Discontent, Freud talks about that suffering is inevitable. And he even gives a list of the body gets sick, the body ages, the external world changes. It's not the best of all possible worlds. There is injustice, there is catastrophe. and that in our relationships, we can feel ambivalence, we can feel conflict, and that Freud highlighting that misery is a kind of common unhappiness that is unavoidable, and that Freud's focus, which has stayed within the field, is how can we decrease what Freud called neurotic suffering. So our conflicts, our understanding of the world, our symptomology, and that's what psychoanalysis had the hope to work with and make better. It would never take away the inevitable common unhappiness that's built into human existence in some way. So I think we see this in this split in between spirituality, spiritual psychologies, and then the strong evidence of working towards symptom reduction. We're not trying to reach enlightenment in psychoanalysis or psychology. We're really trying to have someone suffer less or suffer with meaning or have better way to tolerate their suffering, what might be called like secondary suffering of our mind's creations and the environment brings us, as opposed to the inevitable sufferings in Buddhism, sickness, old age, death, impermanence, that no matter how much psychoanalysis we've had, we would be able to change in some way. And then in Freud, I also saw, these ideas about projection, and this is translated in different ways in Buddhism, from vasanas to Maya, or that we are kind of projecting onto the world what is already there, and very, very difficult to see the world as accurately. There's a Tibetan term, namtak, or conceptual proliferation, that the mind is constantly constructing narratives over top of our experiences, that really it's hard to touch into moments of direct experience with our senses. And was married in a Buddhist influenced Shambhala wedding, and there was a lot of emphasis on getting in touch with our senses and minimizing these kind of constructive projective narratives that we might have on one another. And of course, this goes in Buddhism may use the word of habitual patterns or habitual energies or kind of unconscious, automatic, projective patternings that show up in relationships and in perceptions, and also the desire and the passion and the clinging of kind of needing to have narratives, as opposed to realizing that our narratives are constructed and that there are no ongoing, potentially permanent truths that we can hold on to. We'll talk more about language philosophy and postmodern philosophy in some way. But I also found things that I didn't like in Freud, and particularly this idea Freud had about Buddhism, and every publican of intellectual might have some kind of interpretation about Buddhism with very little practice or very, very little study in some way. But that kind of this was ignorance from reality, seeking this oceanic bliss of that could be found in Buddhism in some way. I think that the heart of Buddhism, as I understand it, is not really a turning away and avoidance of suffering or reality, but really trying to work with our habitualized patterns and our mental patterns in a way to try to experience life more fully and try to understand some form of reality more fully. I've often wondered if the influence of Buddhism on the Western intellectual tradition, in the late 1800s, Buddhist texts were beginning to get translated. And I think of Schopenhauer's, philosophy of misery as kind of a misunderstanding of Buddhist idea that while things are changing, it doesn't mean that there's misery. It doesn't mean that life is just misery. I was really struck when I went to see the Dalai Lama with my child years ago. Someone asked the Dalai Lama, let's take questions today, as opposed to me giving a talk. And the first question was, what's the meaning of life? And the Dalai Lama style of, laughed and said, oh, I haven't heard that before. But emphasized that the meaning of life may be to have an enjoyable life, to take advantage of this sacred human birth that we have. And that in the West, often we might minimize these ideas of enjoyment and look at service or look at achievement. I think of Byung-Chul Han's Achievement Society, Burnout Society. And that he went on to talk about how much he enjoys watching videos of animals and how he has less and less time to do that. But he even still tries to find time for his childhood hobby of taking apart things and seeing how they work, particularly watches in some way. So Freud is just one of many intellectuals that would go and talk about Buddhism. Lacan has this idea of, has a lecture, I think it's seminar 4, about Buddhist eyes. And again, that feels like this is a fantasy of peace, because inevitably as we come into language, we are divided and we have lost our original nature in some way. But at the same time, when Lacan talks about lack, there is, we're always desiring, we're never complete, we're always to some degree groundless. There may be some subjective dissolution that we're moving towards, where we're seeing through the narratives and the meanings that we are creating in some way and getting back to kind of more immediate living. And again, this sounds like basic anxiety from Karen Horney or dukkha from Buddhism in some way. I could go on and on about different public intellectuals' interpretations of Buddhism. I always find Slavson Zizek fascinating and talks about the kind of Buddhism as a capitalist, American Buddhism or Western Buddhism as kind of a capitalist coping mechanism that kind of helps people cope within these neoliberal, capitalistic, unjust systems. And this sounds a lot like mindfulness, and I'll talk more about this later, but mindfulness is used to help people sell more in corporations, or snipers to manage their nerves when they're killing other people, and has really lost the full teachings of compassion, interconnectedness. And then I think of Jordan Peterson of, again, I think maybe more focusing on this kind of appropriation and exploitation of mindfulness as being complicit and being quiet, and that trying to move towards more and more detachment, and that contrasts it with the great Christian religions where we're heroic and saving the world in some way. But again, I think this is a misunderstanding that, as Karl Marx said, save yourself, save the world. That as we begin to understand the world in Buddhism, particularly, there is a compassion that arises to do service to others. We are all interconnected, and to reduce the suffering of other people around us in some way. So let me stop there for some of these, for what I said here.